This is Serious Grower Podcast. I'm Anna. I'm an entomologist. I'm a scientist, and I'm using this podcast to talk to all kinds of growers and eaters who are serious about their farms, their gardens, their local food systems. And I am asking, how can science help? Today's co-host is Casey. She's an experienced market farmer, having grown in Northern California and now out in the Bitterroot Valley in Western Montana. Her and her husband, Jesse, are transitioning into non-commercial farmers. They are homesteaders now. You'll be hearing plenty from her because her experience brings so many unique perspectives and because she's my best friend.
Let me tell you something. I was just reading an article about it and it just kind of escaped my mind for a long time because it was a long time ago. Do you remember Biosphere 2? Where a bunch of people were like, we're going to seal ourselves into this environment and see if we could subsist on our own garden. And it was for a year and they stayed sealed in there. Well, a lot of things happened that they didn't necessarily predict. But one of the biggest things, and it was kind of like the failure point of Biosphere 2, was that they sealed themselves in this sphere, more or less dome. They had brought in a bunch of soil that had highly limited organic matter. As that organic matter went to work, the microbes went to work in this organic matter, all of a sudden the oxygen levels started dropping in the dome because of the all the microbial life. And this was something that hadn't ever been foreseen as a problem in Biosphere 2 with all this rotting, decomposing wood and microbial activity. It dropped the oxygen levels in the air in Biosphere 2 to the point where it was like they were basically the same oxygen level at the top of Mount Everest, So they had to hook up oxygen to Biosphere 2, and they kept going with the experiment.
They forgot that they were outnumbered.
Right. There's like millions and millions of other lives in there too. It wasn't just the human lives in Biosphere 2. And this was like the critical failure point. And there was other things that we learned a lot about, but point being, and it's just like our soil, there's so many things at work. Something inevitably will be unpredictable. I'm still just like, ever since we talked with Caleb that day, I'm just like, oh my God, there's so many factors to the amount of nitrogen that you have available.
But Casey, the thing that really boils my potato is that most soil tests don't even measure nitrogen.
Yeah, I wonder what's up with that.
Because it's too ephemeral. The availability of nitrogen changes so rapidly that if you take a soil test today, it's going to be different tomorrow. And that has to do with all that mineralization that happens with changes in temperature, with changes in the gaseous state or the microbes, or you know what I mean?
Well, just one of the most amazing gardeners that I know is my friend Hillary's mom, and Hillary too, in Vermont. And gosh, it's been like 6 years ago when I was out there, and they always have a big garden, but that particular year they grew a bunch of flowers in their garden because Hillary was getting married and they did their own flowers for her own wedding, which I think was great. And looking at the garden, that's just like a home, just garden bed, tons of flowers. Every single one was just amazingly lush, perfect, like blooms. And I'm talking about outside. This isn't even the greenhouse situation. 0 weeds in the garden and just huge, lush plants. And I was like, this is, the most amazing garden I've ever seen, really. What's the secret? Well, she did a soil test and it did measure nitrogen. She particularly, was measuring the nitrogen and they were a bit low. And then, so yeah, she sprinkled in a bit of the recommended amount of blood meal. And it was just the most amazing garden you've ever seen. And that combined with using old rotted hay as mulch, just kind of pathways in the garden. It was like matted up. The weeds really couldn't poke through. It was so matted up together. And those two things, and it was just easy as could be, really, if you were to just do those two things.
This is what gets me about people who offer advice on the internet about how to garden is that they will show off these luxurious gardens and they don't say, oh yeah, we've been building this soil for 20 or 30 years, or we've been really managing our weed seed bank for 20 or 30 years. Or most of the time it's just fertilize your plants with nitrogen.
Yeah. That's what it was, really. It was the nitrogen that made those plants so big and green, just dark, lush green, with 0 pest problems. Yeah, they had been gardening in that spot for probably 30 plus years. So they had plenty of time to work up their soil. It says she didn't soil test every year, but every few years she'll see, how's it looking? And that was the prognosis that year, was that they could add a bit more nitrogen. I don't know if you'd call it fickle, but it's like you could overdo it with nitrogen really easily, or you could underdo it with nitrogen really easily.
When you're using organic amendments, it's really hard to overdo it with nitrogen. If you're using synthetic fertilizers, it's super easy to overdo it with fertilizer.
I guess the one that I use very sparingly, but blood meal, because, honestly, I think it's just a really kind of icky, gross thing. It's like dried up blood from, cattle and hog slaughter operations. That's just concentrated nitrogen, it's just like dried blood. It really is like plants love it. From like these carnivorous plants. Who am I raising here? Oh my gosh.
So I did go to find out what is on offer in terms of soil testing in Montana and Vermont, and it looks like I was right. They do not offer nitrogen testing in Vermont's standard soil tests. But reading between the lines, I'm going to guess that Hillary's mom got a report from her local extension service along with her soil test with nitrogen recommendations for whatever she was growing. You typically indicate what you plan on growing when you submit your soil, and they include those recommendations with the assumption that you're kind of starting from zero. Sometimes you can integrate a nitrogen credit into this recommendation if you had a nitrogen fixing cover crop on that soil in the previous year. But essentially, they just say this is how much nitrogen you're going to need for a successful crop. Nitrogen requirements will vary drastically for cut flowers. Some heavier feeders like celosia or asters or chrysanthemums might require medium to high amounts of nitrogen. Crops like delphinium, lisianthus, and most of the bulbing flowers like lilies and gladiolus, they require low to medium amounts. For field-grown flowers, we're going to guess like a base rate of 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And for the sake of easier math, let's consider about a pound of nitrogen for a 1,000 square foot bed. A common conventional fertilizer is urea. In humans and other mammals, urea is produced naturally inside the liver through a biochemical pathway called the urea cycle. Industrial urea is not extracted from urine. Instead, it is manufactured synthetically in large chemical plants using the Bosch-Meiser process to make something that is rather concentrated, something like 46% by weight. So if you're aiming for 1 pound of nitrogen, you need a little more than 2 pounds of urea to meet that goal. If you're using blood meal, on the other hand, which is typically 12 to 15% nitrogen, you would need something like 7 or 8 pounds to get to that 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square foot. Folks will typically split that nitrogen because over-fertilizing can cause excessive weak foliage, and sometimes it can mess with flowering. It has more to do with the ratio of nitrogen to some other macronutrients. So many folks will incorporate half of their nitrogen into the soil before planting, and then they'll come in with a soluble liquid fertilizer throughout the summer to make sure that those plants' nitrogen needs are met. And following up with a liquid fertilizer is also very helpful if you were concerned about very heavy rains leaching your nitrogen away from the root zone of your crop. This can happen, especially if you have sandy soil and you get a lot of rain. I'm including some resources both from Vermont and from Montana that include some very nice descriptions of how to interpret your soil tests, wherever you're getting them, if you're getting them from your state extension specialist or from a private testing company. Also, some recommendations on what your target amendments might be, and some advice on how to interpret plant symptoms that indicate potential nutrient deficiencies or excesses. So some people don't go for the soil test. Sometimes they just go for the plant symptoms. But man, the plant symptoms, they look a lot alike. You'd have to really get to know those pretty well. Get yourself a soil test. Back to my conversation with Casey, where she brings up a common approach to liquid fertilizers in the permaculture world.
So here's a new thing that I have never done before, but not in this way. I'm thinking about revisiting compost tea.
Okay.
But here's what I've been leaning towards is like a sort of vegan compost tea. Because a lot of compost tea we've done before might have fish or something like that. Not that I'm like being vegan or anything, but if I could grow all the things that I need to make the compost tea in my garden, here's what I'm getting down to. And I just learned about this and I really wonder if it's true. And it might be my new experiment. Comfrey. Comfrey tea. Comfrey supposedly is like this really deep rooted, almost like invasive. It is. It's invasive, hardy, spreading weed. But with those deep roots, it's, I guess, known for being able to draw all these nutrients from really deep in the soil up into its leaves. And then you can just cut the comfrey leaves off, use that as your compost tea base, and it has all those nutrients that were drawn from deep down in the soil up to those leaves, and you can either compost those or compost tea or even chop and drop, they call it, just like chop them, put them like as mulch right in your garden.
I actually heard my father say this recently too. Something about plants that can draw nutrients from deep down in the soil. Why do you think there's nutrients deep down in the soil that you can't get other places?
If it just has to do with like it can root so deep, it can draw up things that have never been tapped into before. So maybe like your surface couple inches of soil have already been used so much. Nutrients that plants love have already like used that bank of nutrients. And I guess the idea being like you can draw up this untapped reserve.
I get like keeping everything on site so you're not having to bring in materials from off site.
Exactly. It's so just like
Okay.
a homesteady sort of self-sufficient fertilizer,
Okay.
I feel.
Why tea?
I wondered about that myself too. I haven't done the tea yet. We've done compost teas in the past. I've never done a comfrey tea. I've read people just like add tea or add these leaves, water in a bucket, leave it in the sun for like 2 months until it smells gross, and then you got fertilizer without even aerating it. So I'm like, who knows what kind of bacteria you're collecting in there, you know?
But why not just use the compost and spread the
Well,
compost on the beds?
okay, so far I've just done the chop and drop. We're gonna see how that goes. And immediately, like after 1 week, those leaves are shriveling brown. They aren't green at all anymore. They just like immediately browned right up. And it hasn't even been like sunny or hot here in the last week. So that's interesting. So many other leaves would just like stay green for a long time there.
Mhm.
Also, here's another wild card factor with my comfrey is that I got it as a cutting, or not a cutting, but just like a root from a friend and grew it in my garden. I don't know what kind of comfrey it is. I'm not sure if it's one of these cultivars that has been bred to be, what do you call it? When I guess like a hybrid where it couldn't produce its own seed, which a lot of
Yeah.
people grow because it can be so invasive, comfrey. If you allow it to seed, it will just spread all over. And there are varieties that can't self seed that people grow specifically so they don't be so invasive. And that being said, they can be invasive just from their roots too. Here's what I did because I had it in this garden with a bunch of other native plants. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to take over. I just had this realization. It happened last week because it started flowering. It wasn't to the point of seeding yet, but I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know what kind of comfrey I even have here, what I'm dealing with. Let me isolate this from this whole garden, dig it up, put it in like a very isolated spot. We'll see if I really messed up by putting it in that original garden, because from what I've heard, like any tiny little bit of root in that garden left over is still going to grow. So
Really?
I covered it with cardboard, stuck a big like potted plant on top of it. And I got as many of those roots out as I could. Might have been like the same day we last talked, but then yeah, I mean that mulch actually looks amazing over there right now with all those leaves. It's perfect sort of mulch, and if it has all those nutrients as the internet told me, like, that garden's gonna be looking good.
It's so interesting to me how, like, how different my worldview is because I've never considered comfrey to be an issue. I've never seen it become invasive and like take over a garden.
I know that it could. One of the reasons I planted it in that garden, and it's right by my kitchen window, might not be the best spot to have, like, a pollinator garden because anytime I open the kitchen door, like, all these pollinators will fly in my kitchen. It's like, "Why did I do a bee garden here? Jeesh."
Well, I guess it's better than a deer running into your kitchen.
Well, which also has happened, but yeah, we could talk about that in another episode. Anyway, it was just a fun sort of another experiment I did because I planted all these native plants in this garden, and a lot of them are like bee and hummingbird attractive plants. Let me think what else I have out there. Like I have lemon balm. I have arnica. I have a lot of these things are self-seeding, feverfew, some irises that have been there since like we moved in, and who knows how long they've been there, occupying the same spot, like never really spreading or shrinking. Oh, I have some like culinary sage. There's some catmint, some black-eyed Susans that come back every year, echinaceas, and then there's also gay feather, which I love. They go really great with echinacea visually, and a few other things like shiso, which I think is really neat. I have a hollyhock, and then the peony is like the weird cottage sort of outlier of the flower out there that doesn't quite fit in with all these native plants, but also won't go away. The theme of this garden is all those things are just pretty readily spreading, sort of invasive. Every single one of them will come back year after year. That was kind of my experiment to see like what would take over this garden if I just let her go.
Like a death match between all of those.
It was a death match.
So who won?
I think it would have been the comfrey. And I just feel like I was getting out ahead of it. And I just had this like gut feeling I need to move that comfrey. Now, if it's a death match and I don't have that comfrey coming back, which would be good, I think the next like second place is the lemon balm. That lemon balm, oh my gosh, it could very easily take over. Like a lot of those things I will have to cut before they go to seed, even though they spread like well enough by the roots already. The lemon balm is just so invasive. And out of all the things, I kind of wish I hadn't planted that in there, but there we go. We have it forever now. But like mint, cat mint, like any sort of mint is just pretty invasive. It is. It's fun to watch. I'm like, how will this go down? It is. It's like a native garden death match. It's fun. I was like, who's going to win? But at this point, it looks really beautiful. I'll send you a picture of it because these things are just like right up against each other. It's like, here's the sage right up against the arnica, right up against this. Oh, I have like a salvia sort of thing that all these things are just like spreading.
It's kind of a hot and dry area because it's like right up against the house and they're like kind of shouldering each other for resources and they're all doing well.
Shouldering and really like shading out the possibility of any weeds coming up. I mean, that being said, I do pull grass out of there that's seeding in there. But other than that, like it's doing a great job at covering up every single available bit of soil.
I guess whenever it comes to compost tea, there's so much woo-woo magic about it that it almost misses the benefit, like the pros and cons of it, right? It's like you almost feel like it must be better because there's so many more steps.
Our problem with the compost tea that we've done in the past, we would use a sort of aquarium aerator to just like keep it oxygenated. But other than that, we would just kind of leave it and forget it. And then that would be my problem. It'd be like months later, I'm like, oops, forgot about this. It would be, and then it would be like half of it had bubbled off, evaporated away. And then we're left with like, who knows what?
Exactly. Who knows what? But the thing is, like, who knows what's in there no matter what you do? Like, even if you had it perfectly oxygenated, who knows what's in there? And like, that's the thing that gets me.
We were following like a recipe. It was like, add 2 cups of earthworm castings and add like, it was like powdered kelp. And then we were adding fish emulsion. And it's been a little while since we've done those compost teas. Keep it aerated for like 2 weeks and then apply it. I mean, we would spray it.
What if that was like contaminated with like a really small amount of something pathogenic?
Exactly. You got to use your nose and do a sniff test. The same way as like you're making sauerkraut. And actually, sauerkraut is supposed to smell pretty farty. It's like, that's what plants, if it smells farty, you're good to go.
Like a nice, friendly, farty smell.
But yeah, but if it smells sulfury or like a dead mouse, like these are bad smells. These are smells you wouldn't want to eat. Farty, though, is good.
That just seems really rife with like misinterpretation.
Well, still, the whole process of fermentation is so unscientific, really, because you're brewing up whatever bacteria happen to land on it. And then it's like a death match in your fermentation process. You'll go to like fermentation workshops, like go to make your own kimchi, and they'll be like, oh, if you have like green and white mold on the top, just scrape it off. I'm like, what? Really? Like, we have been brewing that, and you're saying that's poison, but it's good to just scrape off and keep going? Like, what? That's so weird. As long as it smells farty.
You can see why I've stayed away from this with it. Like, it's just not my world. I'm just like, I don't need to learn about that. But right now I am thinking like, okay, whenever it comes to like making kimchi or like making these foods where like a lot of these processes have been trial and error over thousands of years, if you think about it. And like, it's safe enough that we know we can put it in our acid stomachs. And for the most part, we're safe. But when it comes to like all the claims that are being made about people who are teaching people how to do compost tea for gardening, I still am like, why not just put the compost in the garden? I still don't understand. Casey, who should I talk to about this? What should I look at?
Elaine Ingham.
Elaine Ingham?
She does composting sort of workshops, and I don't know how deep, but I think pretty deep would go into the rabbit hole of the fermentation processes that are happening. Elaine Ingham.
I'll check it out. Because I do
Check her out.
like a couple times like running across charismatic leaders in this field, like when I lived in Virginia, and they were saying things. So I was like, that can't possibly be true. But I don't want to gloss over the fact that there's good stuff here because like if somebody's giving you a workshop, they're empowering you to do something that you might be afraid to do otherwise. And like you get so much experience just seeing what it looks like, seeing what it smells like. Like I think what you said about does it smell like a fart or does it smell like a dead mouse? Like that's something you can't learn unless you do it. And if you're doing it with somebody who's like, yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
That's an invaluable experience.
Right. It's never going to be the same twice. You do the same exact thing. It's not going to be the same the second time because of just environmental factors. It depends so much on just time of year, the temperature in the air. Like, how long is it going to take? It's going to take longer if it's colder out. How cold is too cold? Will it go bad if it's too cold? Yeah.
What are oh shit situations and what are like, yeah, you're fine situations?
Yeah. There's like, oh shit situations where, but yeah, both. I feel like you got to just follow your nose. But yeah, there's like certain sort of like controls that I don't know, you'd say controls, but just measures that, like compost, you would use a compost thermometer. If it was not hot enough, you know you don't have the processes going on to actually get the composting action. But if it's too hot, then you've gone anaerobic. If it smells alcohol-y, you have done wrong. If you smell like ammonia smell, that means you waited too long to stir. The sniff test for so many things.
Well, I'm on the case. So I didn't know a ton about comfrey. Just looking at the Wikipedia entry, I learned that comfrey contains a mixture of phytochemicals in varying amounts, like allantoin, mucilage, saponins, tannins. All these chemicals are associated with some healing properties. However, comfrey is really high in some alkaloids that are responsible for liver toxicity, which is associated with consuming this plant or its extracts, like a lot of it over time. So most of the time in modern herbalism, comfrey is really only used topically as a poultice, like if you have a wound or something like that. In 2001, the United States Food and Drug Administration issued a ban of comfrey products marketed for internal use and a warning label for those intended for external use. It's definitely discouraged for use by those who are pregnant, lactating, definitely not for use for infants and anybody who has any kind of liver, kidney, or vascular diseases that can't handle that kind of chemical. But what Casey is talking about is really different. When she was talking about comfrey tea, she was talking about like a fermented tea or a plant tea where uncomposted plant materials are placed in water and allowed to ferment. I don't know. Plant teas or these fermented teas where you're using uncomposted plant material. That is completely different than what we're talking about when we're talking about compost tea. So I did read the 5th edition of Elaine Ingham's The Compost Tea Brewing Manual, and I also learned of Dr. Ingham's passing this year. From her obituary, Ingham will be remembered by her many soil science and farmer students as someone who advocated for soil health as environmental and public health, and who explored and remained ever fascinated by the soil's web of life. She is survived by her husband, 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and a granddog. I will also note from the New York Times article, the title of her obituary in the New York Times was Elaine Ingham, who taught us that soil is alive, passes at age 71, which I found very touching. But from her book, compost tea is simply a liquid extract of mature compost. And the term tea maybe is a little bit misleading depending on where you're coming from, because we usually think about extracting those really small chemical compounds that are responsible for flavor and some of these medicinal products that we're talking about. We're talking about comfrey. When we make a hot tea, this is different. This is essentially a cold brew extraction of all the aqueous nutrients that were in the compost. So water-soluble nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. While warmer water could influence the extraction rate, you're not really wanting that temperature to be hotter than 75 or 80 degrees because you want to avoid killing the beneficial microbes that get extracted along with all those nutrients. Hot water can also decrease the amount of oxygen that water can hold, and you will need to keep that extraction aerated with oxygen in order to keep alive all the microorganisms that were in the original compost. Thus, the compost has to be tea quality. Those organisms selected by the temperature, foods present, nutrient composition, oxygen content in the tea, they grow during that brewing process. So you put water in it, let it sit for a little while, keep it oxygenated. When the oxygen drops below a certain level, nutrients can be lost and disease-causing organisms can grow. So that is different from the uncomposted comfrey tea that we're talking about, not to be confused with compost tea. Every time I am made aware of things that are part of the permaculture world, my brain just goes like, because there's just so much information. There's so much conflicting information. Other people, everybody has their own personal opinions about it, and they're talking over each other. They're not really listening to each other. Every time I go on to r/permy or whatever, it seems like it's just people fighting. And I want to see if you have a
Slash anything is just people fighting.
Yeah, that's true. But I think people they're talking over each other and they're talking about lots of different things. So I wanted to see if we could figure out what some of these terms actually mean and what your understanding of some of these terms are.
This sounds fun. Okay, so
Okay.
just shout out the term and I'll tell you what I think it means.
Chop and drop.
Chop and drop. Okay, this is what I've heard about doing with comfrey is chop the comfrey out of the ground, chop it up into little bits to whatever area into mulch, and then just leave it there. Chop and drop. It's like a mulching method.
It's a mulching method. So if you're doing a chop and drop method, you're purposely growing your comfrey or whatever your chop and drop crop is. And you're planting in that bed or next to that bed, or what? How are you doing that?
I did chop and drop with my comfrey that I just cut down about a month ago. Dropped it onto this bed that was already existing. I didn't plant anything extra into it.
But it sounded like the comfrey that you're growing, where the roots are getting down deep, it's supposedly pulling up nutrients. I'm a little skeptical of that. But
Right.
you're chopping it, you're dropping it. And so it's doing two things, actually, because they have big, luxurious leaves. It's like a weed management thing, like you're covering and mulching with this comfrey. Sounds like it dries up really quickly, and then it'll compost in place over time. Is that kind of what that is?
It does. It dries up real quick. The chop and drop thing, this is my first time doing this with comfrey, and I was amazed at how quick it dried. It was 2 days just laying on the surface. It's just dried brown leaf. But at the same time, it hasn't gone anywhere. It seems like you want that into the soil. At this point, it's just mulch. It's not in the soil yet as nutrients.
Yeah.
Or maybe just when it does get watered, it is kind of infusing sort of like a tea into the substrate underneath it.
Well, we'll get to that. Before we get to that, and this might be something is a conversation for another day, but you had mentioned that there's different strains of comfrey, some that are more invasive than others. And
Right.
I just want to know, why are people so obsessed with invasiveness? I think it's white women policing other white women, saying, that's invasive, you're bad for growing it. Or where do you think this obsession with, what do you think?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. That's invasive. I wonder what I would get yelled at by a white lady for growing. It's probably raspberries.
Part of the conversation, which I think is really helpful, which I think is what you said, is that you got it from a friend and they said, oh, it can be a little invasive. And what they meant is it could take over your garden. Not that it's bad for the ecosystem. Those are two different things. Your friend was just saying, watch out, it could get away from you, versus the people on the internet who are saying, oh, it's bad for the environment to grow non-native plants?
Well, around here, we have a weed district and everything, Ravalli County. And a lot of Western counties do. I think it's, where there's livestock, big livestock sort of
Mhm.
county. There is like going to be a weed management program. They sponsor all these billboards every year. It'd be like, look out for this weed. If you see it, pull it. Or sometimes you aren't supposed to pull it. Sometimes you mow it. They'll tell you the best way to deal with these weeds. They do a good job of getting the word out of these specific plants and letting you know what they look like and letting you know that they're detrimental to either livestock or the grass or something like
Okay, because there's going to be certain plants that are noxious, like they're actually bad for cows to eat.
right. But other
Okay.
ones, they would just block the grass from growing. So both of those, the weed district is really concerned about because they're all about protecting grazing. So yeah, around here, I don't think any white lady's going to come and be like, why are you growing comfrey? She's going to be like, you really let that bindweed get away from you. It'll be a
Yeah.
weed that people are concerned about here. And yeah, bindweed is a thing that just one single plant and gets away from you. We just did one term so far, chop and drop.
Chop and drop. And then we talked about why people are so worked up about invasives, which I think is important. Distinguish between how people use the word invasive, kind of colloquially, what we really mean when we say invasive, and then noxious as being even more dangerous, like it could be toxic. Remember how when we were talking, I was kind of saying, what's the deal with bringing up nutrients from the roots? And like, what's the deal with tea and da da da. And I think what we landed on with why tea was more that if you have a fully matured compost that has all of these soil nutrients in it, those nutrients that are available can be kind of cold brew extracted from that compost and delivered to your crop like a liquid fertilizer. And that was kind of the benefit of using a compost tea from a nutrition point of view.
And well, so I haven't done the compost tea yet with the comfrey. I just did the chop and drop so far, but
Well, I am a little bit skeptical of this because I actually did look up the nutritional content of comfrey leaves compared to other fertilizers. You remember how you were talking about bone meal being like really high nitrogen? So in your mind,
or
especially
or it's a blood meal.
blood meal, excuse me. So
Yep.
starting with what we think of the standard for synthetic fertilizers, one of the cheapest synthetic sources of nitrogen is urea. And that is something like 46% nitrogen by weight. When you look at blood meal, that's 13%. So when
Whoa.
you go to urea down to blood meal, which is like for you, the hottest high test nitrogen source you have, 46 to 13. And then when you go down to the next highest nitrogen content that is like under this vegan compost kind of thing, we're talking about alfalfa meal. That's
Mm.
3%.
Mm.
Do you want to guess how much comfrey is?
Well, if you're saying that alfalfa meal is the highest vegan one at 3%, I would assume that comfrey's below that.
It is below that. So soybean meal, actually, it ranges like from 3% to 5%. Comfrey leaves, it's like 1%.
Hmm.
Comfrey tea is 0.5%.
Ah, interesting.
It's just a matter of like on a pound per pound basis. But what we were talking about before is the beauty of it is that you're growing it yourself. And all of these synthetic fertilizers, all these other fertilizers that you bring in from off farm, they're concentrated, completely separate and aside from delivering nitrogen and other important macronutrients to your crops, is that people will use compost tea as a pesticide. And the principle of that is that, like, if you have a really microbially complicated thing to literally spray on your plants, if you have a very complicated leaf surface or root surface or whatever, any pathogen can't dominate.
Yeah, I know we joke about foliar feeding, but this is really what you're actually doing when you spray compost tea is you're just inoculating the leaf surface with a whole
Yes.
bunch of microbes so that one particular species can't dominate.
Yes.
Yeah, basically, compost tea brewing is brewing like microbiota, a very diverse. And it doesn't matter like whatever is going to be prevalent in there. It can depend on the weather and like the situation when your compost is composting. But as long as it's diverse, it's good to go.
Yeah, right. And that's why I loved what you had said about like smelling it and having the experience of knowing it could have gone the wrong way, and don't spray it on your plants if it smells like a dead mouse. What is a lot harder to tell is if there's E. coli contamination. And most of that contamination comes from when you're using animal manures, right? Because the pathogens that are dangerous to us from a food safety point of view, they are more likely to come from animal manures, other municipal sewage. I don't know if you've heard there's an outbreak right now of explosive diarrhea across the country.
Uh-huh.
Basically, something got into the water on one or two big, huge farms. And those
Hmm.
big, huge farms produce so much food, and it spreads so far that like one or two problems could end up being a national outbreak. It's so crazy.
Yeah, I know they still haven't got to the bottom of exactly what happened with the explosive diarrhea outbreak. I didn't realize they already like it pinpointed it to these couple huge farms, but
That's usually what happens, right? So I'm
okay.
going to guess that there's just not as many people working at the government anymore. So
Hmm.
what usually happens is that they do an investigation. They usually figure out that it came from one or two places. Like this happens every once in a while. This year, it seems like that investigation is either not going well or I don't know. But this happens frequently. And they usually figure out, like, oh, whoops, they had a problem with their irrigation water. And it's almost always like one or two farms.
Well, with less people working at the government to regulate such things, probably more instances of explosive diarrhea outbreaks are going to be happening.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that drives you crazy about situations like this. Just recently, within like the past decade or so, they enacted something called FSMA, so the Food Safety something something. And so like there was multiple government agencies that were overseeing food safety. And the farmers who were being impacted by this were pretty bullshit about it because those two agencies weren't doing a good job of talking to each other. So when you say, oh, let's have less regulation or like let's have fewer people involved, it seemed like there's a lot of bureaucrats with their fingers and a lot of pies. It would have made so much sense to like streamline that. The initial idea behind Doge would have been really great if they had known anything about how the government ran or actually had good intentions and they did it. That would have been cool. But what they did was just like fire all the people who just see where the poop comes from. I would like to keep those people on board, please.
Yeah, I would like the poop monitors to remain employed.
The government's just too big to keep all the poop monitors employed.
I feel like that is the point of like, yes, too big to fail. We can't let that system fail. Out
Mhm.
of all the things that are too big to fail, you would think agriculture.
Yeah. So they're still in the process of rolling out the FSMA rules, which were very interesting because they had started out with rules for large scale ag. But then they started saying, okay, like even those small scale farms, like actually even like your scale farms, we need to make a set of rules for them, but we want to make sure it's right for them. So the way that it started out was that like if you sell at a farmer's market, you just need to make sure that your product has a name and address so that like if somebody gets sick, they have the name and address. Like that was bare bones for small scale ag. And then they've kind of been rolling out more and more rules about different food safety things. And a lot of that is like recommendations on how to do wash
Right.
bags.
It's recommendations. It's
Mhm.
not like a law or anything.
Mm-mm.
And it wasn't even our produce, but it was our eggs. You had to have your name of your farm and your address on your eggs. And then
Mm.
at the same time, and it wasn't a law, but a recommendation for washing your produce, you had to have on site a hand washing station that was separate from your produce washing station, you know? And those were like the two things. And like I said, they're both highly recommended. It wasn't a law. Nobody's coming to monitor our sink. We put one in. We put in a dedicated hand washing station. We even made a big deal about it and like even had this plaque that's like hand washing only.
Don't poop in this.
Yeah, don't poop in this sink.
I think we've teased apart all of the base benefits of using these products and like all these different approaches, like the difference between chop and drop, using compost, using fertilizers, using a tea. Like there are benefits to using tea, but a lot of things get conflated because you just use the term foliar feeding. And that's not a fertilizer approach. It's a pesticide. You're using it as a pesticide. And I think as soon as people use the word pesticide, most permaculture people would be like, well, I don't use pesticides. I don't do that.
I'm thinking more and more like compost tea is like a probiotic. Imagine your own gut and what a probiotic is to encourage healthy intestinal flora. Compost tea is like the same thing, but for plants. In everything in my whole life, it has to be some sort of analogy for me to understand it.
Right. And in that analogy, everybody knows that when you take a probiotic, that's not the same as eating a cheeseburger. You're not getting your macronutrients, you're not getting your protein and your carbohydrates from it, but it's doing something else that's making everything work a little bit better. Like there's buffering, like there's all this like soil chemistry. Well, I will leave it there for now, but I would love to hear from you. How do you approach your nitrogen needs in your crop? Do you have any death matches going on in your yard right now? Who will win? Serious Grower Podcast is a production of New Hampshire Community Supported Research. If you are interested in becoming a co-host or would like to learn more about our mission to democratize agricultural research, visit our website at nhcsr.org. And make sure to check out our YouTube channel at NHCSR, where we're sharing insights from the agricultural research community and vlogging our research efforts on the farm. You can support this work by liking and subscribing, and even better, consider joining our Patreon community.